just because they were building African communities and they're beginning to develop forms of state that was more sophisticated, more advanced, more complex than the simple chiefdom model. People began to build towns and cities, empires. All of this is states, right? But that doesn't make it Pan Africanism. It was state building. It was African people. They were diverse. But it doesn't make it Pan Africanism. I think Pan Africanism is intentional. And that's what I'm talking about here. The intentions of those who were building African civilizations, and states, nations, prior to the transatlantic slave trade. You know? And so it's a question of, does Pan-Africanism exist prior to the transatlantic slave trade? How can it without an ideal or identity connecting a group of people in the world to Africa, the continent? How? The people of Manding were connected to the lands of the Manding. And the influence went as far as the language speakers did. They weren't thinking about the whole Africa. That wasn't their concept. Wasn't their ideal, wasn't their identity. Same could be said for the leaders and people of Oyo, of the Congo. Of all these ancient kingdoms and peoples and nations from the medieval times that make up our direct African ancestries. Very important what I'm saying, because it was people from these places who were taken to a foreign place by force that first developed the ideals of a continental Africanism. That's just the reality of it. There's nothing we can do to change that reality. But I think some people prefer an alternative reality. A reality in which Pan-Africanism has existed since Adam and Eve. You know, this romantic ideal that doesn't mark a time of origins for an ideal. A relatively new ideal, not an ancient ideal. And I think it's all about not giving credit to members of the African family who created ideals outside of Africa that are designed and meant to manifest in Africa. You know, here in Sierra Leone, they refer to the Creoles as coming from the ex-slaves. They still got that talk in their language here. It's still not their own cousins returning. It's still these dehumanized beings called slaves that don't have a place anywhere, that don't have a right anywhere, that were just subjected to the mercy of everyone, including the Africans, who didn't see themselves as slaves. So I don't think people really understand that you can't really deal with history without making sure that you humanize all of the people in the story. You can't leave us in a dehumanized state and tell the story correctly, because you're not really dealing with people who think, people who feel, people who have their own aspirations, their own willpower, people who are making their own contribution to whatever was happening at the same time. and have been wiped out of history books. You see? So this restoration is not just about remembering something. It's about what we have forgotten and what has been hidden from us. We've forgotten more than we know. We've forgotten more than we know. So even when you look at the Maroons and the early resistance in America, where people were separating themselves and living in independent communities on their own terms, independent free Maroon communities. Even then, they had to fight constantly to stay free, to stay in that state. So they weren't necessarily free because they were constantly in a state of defending that freedom. In other words, their freedom was still contested. It hadn't yet been won. Although we admire the fight, we have to understand that as well. That these weren't nations. These were communities. These were communities of resistance that sought independence, that sought liberation. But we can't confuse them either. You know, this was community building, community liberation. If you wasn't a Maroon, then you wasn't under them conditions, right? And so it's the same thing all across the board. That's not Pan Africanism. That's not all Africanism. That's some Africanism. Some of the Africans, not all. And whenever it's dealing with some of us and not all of us, you know it's not Pan. Pan is when it's dealing with all of us. And that's how you know when you're operating at that level. When you just say, well, it's just the black people from Jamaica, I'm talking about the Jamaican community. That's what you're talking about. You ain't talking about all of us. You're talking about the Jamaican national interest. National interest of people, African people who identify as Jamaicans. That's all you're talking about. It's limited. It's not all, it's some. You can't turn that into Pan-Africanism. That's not what Pan-Africanism is. It's the policies, it's the institutions, it's the organizations, the movements, the leadership, the philosophies that promote the ideal of an all-Africanness, a oneness, a one-Africanness that we all share in common. Nobody has it more than the other. We're all equally it. And so this is where you're talking about the universal African nationalism of Garveyism, as opposed to the all-Africanism of Pan-Africanism, ideologically. And so some of us are fighting for the unborn African nation to come into existence, to finally free the motherland, the resources, the people, so that the whole race all around the world can be the primary and first beneficiaries of what our lands are naturally endowed with. That is our mission. There's nothing criminal or hateful about it. It's justice that we want. If the world is just, then why are we poor? Something criminal has been taking place for a long time in African economic, social, political relations. And that's what we're trying to correct. It's never about hating others. It's not even about loving everybody. You know? It's about building or destroying. Which one are we going to do? Yeah. But just because somebody is pushing a doctrine that unifies some Africans doesn't make it Pan-African. And historically, when we're looking back to see instances of when it was policies and practices that was applied and benefited to in definition to all Africans. And when we talk about a Negro clause in the Liberia Constitution, that's a Pan-African clause. It may not be a Pan-African government, but that's a Pan-African clause. That's an actual political, constitutional expression of Pan-Africanism. Saying that only Negroes can get citizenship in that country and own land in that country. Only Africans. When it's only African, is it all African? If it's exclusively to Africans and it's open to all Africans, is it Pan-African? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. The difference between Pan-Africanism and universal African nationalism is that we sort you out. We make sure you're nationalistic, that you're fighting for one Africa, that you understand what you're fighting for. One is an ideology, another one is a objective. One is a political movement. One is the movement of a people, a mass movement. All is everybody. That's mass. There's going to be various ideologies within Pan-Africanism. Different schools of thoughts, different interpretations, different ways of going about Pan-Africanism because it's dealing with all of us. Well, of course, we're the most diverse people on earth, especially if we're talking about political ideology or cultural systems. We're diverse. We're diverse. So Pan-Africanism is naturally something that is diverse, that has to accommodate the diversity of the race. Yeah. Whereas African nationalism teaches us what we should do with our power and our resources. Race first.